It's seen its share of dive bars, pizza parlors, and five and dimes. It's been home to an annual festival since 1981 that routinely draws crowds of over 100,000 people. This is Main Street, and while it may seem a little quieter than usual, make no mistake, it's still the heart of Laurel, Maryland. I'm Richard Friend, and this is Lost Laurel. What better place to start our historic tour of Main Street than here at the far end of it? We're at the corner of 9th and Main, where since 1996 this building has been home to the Laurel Museum. There's a good reason for that. It's the oldest house in Laurel. Originally a mill worker's house, some estimates date it as early as 1801, but most place its construction in the 1840s. Let's meet Laurel Historical Society board member Jean Levin, who can tell us more about the building's history.
The house we're in used to be a tenant house for the mill, which was that way, basically the pool footprint and further back. It was the home for 4 families. We're in one section now. This would have been for one entire family. And then on the other side one, and then 2 upstairs. And then all 4 of their kitchens would have been in the basement. After that, it was a general, after that, it was other things for the mill, like a general store and other things. Well, we knew we wanted a house. We were ready. Several people in Laurel were very interested in preserving the history of Laurel, and so we started looking at what was available. Harrison Beard building was available. This was available, and I believe one other building that for right now I cannot remember. But after looking at, they were all in disrepair, and the city had all of them, and after looking at all of them, trying to make a decision which one to rehab, this one was the one that seemed to be the best one to renovate. So when we were getting to the renovations and ripping down the walls, one of the things they found was a ledger from the general store, which was really interesting, we all know how much things were. We joke about how, a loaf of bread was this much, but really seeing it with our own 2 eyes with somebody physically writing in each thing and people's grocery list and what they were buying, and that was really interesting. When our last exhibit was the first time we showcased this property to be what it used to be. The original founders of the Historical Society and of the museum purposely didn't want it to just be a house museum. They wanted it to be all of Laurel. And so all of our exhibits over the years have been about all of historic Laurel, and more recently even further out, like even the racetrack. But last year we went back to, our roots, so to speak, and turned this section back into what it was. And if you think about, the average family here had, a few kids and often a tenant with them. Maybe like a unmarried sister or cousin or somebody. And so you're talking about at least 3 adults in here and children. So, we really spent a lot of time thinking about, how small these quarters were, and that, they had to get their water from the spring out back, and all of their kitchens were in the basement. So if you lived upstairs, you had to actually go outside and come back in to go into your kitchen. If you lived on this floor, you were in the deluxe suite and you could just go straight down one of these staircases. But we don't have a ton of stories because although Horace Capron, who ran the mill on and off, kept amazing journals, they were mostly about the mill, not so much about the people. And so what we really have are just a bunch of pictures. And so we have to sort of put a story to those pictures. There was one picture that was over that way, I believe, during the exhibit that showed the current employees. It was like an employee photo. And we were surprised at the number of women. Lots of women and lots of children, because we know from mills, children are, can get their fingers in things a lot easier. And how loud it was in there and how little they were paid. We have lots of records about pay. And it was a typical factory town. You got paid, and then you also went to the store, and that's how all of Main Street really started to form, was to support what was going on around here.
At the turn of the last century, most of the real action was at this west end of Main Street, specifically here at the corner of 6th and Main. A lot of that had to do with the electric trolley line that ran between Laurel and Washington, D.C. From 1902 to 1925, this was the termination point. In fact, the station itself is still here. It was rotated 90 degrees to face Main Street, where over the years it became Denny McCahill's Town Tavern, Oliver's Saloon, Main Street Sports Grill, and is actually in the process of becoming Oliver's once again. The 500 block remains one of the most distinctive on Main Street. It's seen a lot of different tenants over more than a century. Today it houses 3 popular Laurel businesses, Olive on Main, the Laurel Mill Playhouse, and Sean Patrick's Pet Spa. Let's meet one of the board of directors of the Laurel Mill Playhouse.
It was, I'm told that the building was 100 years old. It was actually burned partially down 100 years ago. And so I'm not sure exactly how old the actual original structure is, but the current facility is 100 years old. And it's had quite a few different businesses here. There's been a photography studio, a general store. I know that the previous owner told me that they used to have USO dances upstairs in the 40s. And so it's seen a lot of action. I happened to be driving up Main Street one afternoon and noticed a for sale sign in the window. So I stopped the car, peered through the window, couldn't see much, but determined that there was a fair amount of space. And so we came back and got into the building to see it closer, and determined that it was feasible to renovate it and make it into a live community theater. And so we went back and voted to take on this project. And in November of 2001, we purchased the building, one of the few community theaters that actually owns our own facility. It was quite dilapidated when we first moved in. A lot of renovation had to take place. Of course, we had to gut the whole building. And the stage area, one wall had to be totally rebuilt. It was a challenge. They didn't have 16-inch centers for the wall. So we had to change things around. We used, like for the stage area, I used 4x4s to make sure that it was safe because a lot of the wall had been totally eaten away. I had to get some expertise from my cousin happens to be an engineer, and he told me how to shore up the ceilings because we did take away a wall that would have been in front of the stage, but we determined it wasn't load-bearing. But it presented quite a few challenges and just about everything. It's just like any other building. When you start to open things up, you find more problems. I pulled out a furnace over in our hallway now and found the floor was totally gone underneath. It had been backfilled with soot, I assume, from the original fire. And so we worked for almost 2 years, just under 2 years, and we finally were able to open in 2003 with our first production, which was primary English class. And we've been going strong ever since.
We do between 9 and 10 shows a year. Our shows run 2 to 3 to 4 weekends with one dark weekend in between. We do musicals, mysteries, comedies, children's shows, children's Shakespeare, adult Shakespeare. The first show that we have coming up next is October the 10th, and that is called For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. And it's a choreo poem. It gives some experiences that it's an all-black woman cast, and it gives experiences of people. It was a famous movie, and it just talks about some of the experiences that these ladies have been through. It's different monologues with a little bit of dancing in there. So it's going to be something that will be good for the adults to come and see. October 31st, we have a mystery. It's called Death Takes a Holiday. And it's a great mystery about death, who takes on a human form and then falls in love with real people, and then how it ends. And then coming in December, White Christmas, the musical, is coming here.
Some of the most memorable shops have lived on this short block, including Cordelia's Bakery, Something Special, and Laurel Office Machines. The businesses have changed, but the 500 block still looks much as it did when horses were parked alongside it rather than cars. Today, Selborne House, a senior apartment complex just across the street, occupies an entire block of Main Street at 5th, but for nearly 60 years it was the site of Laurel's favorite hardware store, Cook's. Residents still fondly remember the squeak of the wooden floors and the pleasant mixture of smells inside the store that seemingly had everything. At the corner of 4th Street is the Citizens National Bank building, the first nationally chartered bank in all of Prince George's County. Erected in 1890, this brick building remains the cornerstone of the expanded bank, which received additions in 1910, 1948, and 1960. The building cost a whopping $3,333 to construct, which was only about $500 more than it cost to build the vault inside it. The bank was subjected to a daring robbery one day back in 1911. Historian Kevin Leonard recently wrote about this in his History Matters column for the Laurel Leader.
So in September of 1911, a 17-year-old kid walked into the bank with a gun and was trying to rob the place. The only customer in the place was Mr. Harry Block, who owned Block's department store for many decades here on Main Street. And when he said, "Hands up," Mr. Block and the cashier, they didn't take him seriously at first because they could tell, even though he had a mask on, that he was a young kid. And he got very annoyed at this, and then he started threatening them, and they decided, okay, this was real. They put their hands up, and the teller started putting money in the bank, in the bag that the kid had passed over. And the kid spotted Mr. Block's wallet on the counter and told him he wanted the wallet too. And they started arguing about that because Mr. Block told him there was nothing of value in it. It was at this point in the argument that George Waters, who was the head cashier, he stepped out of the other side of the bank with a pistol in his hand, and he shot a bullet up into the ceiling. This scared off the kid. He ran out, and Mr. Waters fired another shot at him as he was running away, but missed. A crowd gathered here at the bank, a shot being fired. We'll do that. Mr. Waters took control. He sent one party down one end of Main Street to the train station to make sure the kid didn't get away on a train. The other sent another party to the other end on 6th Street, where the trolley to D.C. ended, to make sure he didn't jump on a trolley. So there was a huge crowd here. In the meantime, the kid, running for his life up the alley, spots one of the barns, and he hides in the barn. He was flushed out of the barn by the owner, and at that point he was spotted by an 18-year-old Laurel resident who chased him up the alley and found him hiding in an outhouse behind the Episcopal Church. So he didn't have his gun anymore. He'd left it in the barn. So the kid gave himself up to the 18-year-old, who marched him back here to the bank. There was a huge crowd here in front of the bank. They put him under arrest. They interrogated him, and he gave them a really sad story about how he was desperate, he had no money, he was on his way to see his sister, and he ran out of money, decided to rob a bank. And he really convinced everyone of this sad story. When he went to trial, a lot of people, including the president of the bank, who testified on his behalf because they all bought the story, testified for clemency. He was found guilty, and they set a date for sentencing. It was in between the guilty verdict and the sentencing that the true story came out, that he was a 17-year-old kid, but he was from Roanoke, Virginia. And in fact, he had been arrested 2 years earlier in Hyattsville for armed robbery when he was only 15. So when this came out, the judge at sentencing threw the book at him, gave him 5 years in the state penitentiary.
Across the street from the bank, in the building that's now Finders Keepers, was the Laurel Furniture Company, which opened in 1904. Baby Products Incorporated took over the space in the mid-1970s. In the middle of the block at number 385 was Laurel's favorite variety store, Gavril's. Run by the wonderful Christina, Nick, and Theodore Gavril's, the family served Main Street from 1910 to 1989, with sandwiches, milkshakes, and homemade Easter candy that's still talked about to this day. At the corner of Avondale is the site of what was once one of Laurel's longest surviving businesses, Block's Apparel Store. Opened in 1897, Block's faced an unpaved main street that was lined with hitching posts. By the 1950s, it adapted to the times, getting a modern facelift unlike anything else in town. Block's closed its doors in 1974, making the front page of the Laurel Leader. Both the store and the newspaper had gone into business 77 years earlier. Before it closed, Block's was one of the first stores that agreed to remove its overhanging neon sign. By the late 1960s, Main Street had begun to take on a, quote, honky-tonk appearance, according to local leaders, and a beautification committee was formed. The city actually bought the signs from the business owners, then had them removed. By the end of the 1970s, Main Street was ready for a much-needed repaving and overhaul, an overhaul that would end up being the catalyst for an annual celebration that's more popular than ever. Main Street has always been busy, but since 1981, there's one day that people are actually encouraged to walk in the middle of the street, the Main Street Festival. Laurel's first Main Street Festival took place on Saturday, May 16, 1981, celebrating the recent completion of a public improvement project on the street that included repaving, new street lights, and trash cans. But it almost didn't happen. Some merchants, having suffered through 9 months of these street repairs, had already lost up to 25% of their business. They worried that closing on a Saturday might cost them even more. But some, like Carlo Petrucci, were vocal in their support of the festival, quote, regardless of whether it's big or small. And Bob Cook, who co-chaired the event, believed that the benefits to be reaped from the festival couldn't be measured in monetary terms on that one day alone. These visitors will be back after the festival and will become regular customers, he said. They'll see things they've never seen before. And 33 years later, that's true to this day.
The festival started back in 1980. I was on the city council back then, and we were, at that time there was an effort to begin revitalizing Main Street and all of that. So one of the things that the Board of Trade came up with was to have the festival, and it would kind of highlight the local merchants on the street, and they got a few vendors, other vendors in, food vendors, etc., and then it grew from there. I remember specifically a couple of the store owners who were very concerned with taking away their business that day, and that was the big issue. And I think over the years, and they were encouraged to keep their store open because you were going to have lots more people on the street walking around and stopping in and looking. So it was kind of a dynamic tension going on there between the board and the store owners. And all of the store owners have been given, they get a free booth in front of their stores, so that's there for them. And then, of course, they can keep the stores open. This festival draws anywhere from between 50 and 75 or 80,000 people a year. That's the estimates that the police have given. And the street is completely packed. We have vendors on each side of the street, and it runs from 7th Street all the way down to Route 1. That's almost practically a half-mile worth of vendors. There's over 350 vendors or more, and it's an amazing time. I'm not sure I don't recall whether we started off with a parade at the beginning, but eventually they got that worked into the scenario. The parade is, this year, we run about 60 or more units in the parade, and we start setting it up in February and getting the word out and collecting people, getting them interested. And then the other part is then we have to get the write-ups for the announcements that the people, they do as they go by the reviewing stand. We also use the Laurel Amateur Radio Club to help us line the people up on parade, which takes up all of 6th Street from Main Street up. We have prizes that are given out to various groups, youth groups, best community organizations, commercial vehicles, etc. So there's little trophies given out. We select judges. We have judges that judge the parade, and it's quite an event. Just as a piece of trivial history, I remember with our Laurel Amateur Radio Club, we've worked the information booth for them for many years, since the 90s at least. And years ago, one of the issues with the thing is the weather, because it's an outdoor event, and if you have a significant weather problem like a major thunderstorm, you want to know so you can shut down and get everybody out of danger's way. And I remember one year we had Howard Leonard was home at on the new thing, the cable TV thing, and he was watching the storm coming in from Virginia and radioing in where it was, and because we were trying, it was like middle of the day and we didn't know if we were going to have to close down, and we wanted enough time. And that was back before you had the little your smartphones that you could look on and see everything. It was kind of cool, and that day the storm split and went two different places, and it didn't come here, and we stayed open. I think we've only had about one instance where we had to shut down a little early because of the weather, and that's been amazing.
One of Main Street's most familiar and dependable shops is the Laurel Meat Market. But would you ever have guessed that before it became the meat market, it was a dress shop for fashionable Laurel ladies? Eve McKnight ran the Vogue at this location throughout the 1950s before ultimately relocating to Laurel Shopping Center. It's a whole different building today, but longtime residents remember the days when Keller's and Knapp's newsstand ruled the corner of Main and B Streets. Opened in 1947 by Charlie Keller, the Laurel News Agency was the hub of Main Street for almost the next 50 years. Known for its out-of-town newspapers, racing forums, as well as an ample selection of gentlemen's magazines, the store also sold all the essentials, including hot coffee, fresh produce, and even live bait. Charlie's son-in-law, Fred Knapp, took over the family business in the early 1980s, and it continued on until 1995 when the property was sold. Over 100 years old and on its last legs, the house was demolished, and the new Revere Bank was built on the site in 2006. The Hershey's ice cream sign that had hung over the entrance for decades was preserved by the Laurel Historical Society, and it's currently on display at the museum as part of the Lost and Found Laurel exhibit that runs until December. The big vacant building at 322 Main Street was most recently the Laurel Art Center. From 1977 until its closing in 2012, the store was heaven for artists of all ages and experience. Owned by Leo Emery and family, the store had vast quantities of every art supply imaginable, including some that even the manufacturers had stopped making. The antique coin-operated Lazy Bones ride in the store was actually a stayover from a previous business, the original store that opened on the site in 1950, Poland's 5-cent to $1 store. Much of the art center's eclectic interior was actually salvaged from the popular Five and Dime, which operated for about 25 years before trying a new concept, a mixed-use space called Poland's Mini Mall. Unfortunately, it only lasted for a few months, but who knows, with this much space available, maybe someone new will come along and try it again. Another vacant building in the 300 block at the moment is one that's special to many current and former residents, one whose vacancy and potential demolition recently struck a chord. It's the original Laurel Theater. Opened in 1929, the theater enjoyed a long run of success until the mid-60s, when the new cinema at Laurel Shopping Center opened, as well as Wineland's Laurel Drive-In. The theater closed in 1976, but soon experienced a renaissance in the form of Petrucci's Dinner Theater, which operated until 1992. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, a number of local comedy clubs called it home, including Arts, the Comedy Connection, the Laurel Cinema Cafe, and most recently, The Joke's on Us. A few big-name comedians played the building, too, including a young Dave Chappelle. The city of Laurel recently purchased the building with plans to demolish it, but there's renewed public interest in exploring ways to save the historic building and repurpose it, like seeking grants to rebuild it to specs matching the original 1929 theater and having it become a cultural center in the heart of Laurel's Arts District, much like Silver Spring's AFI Silver Theater. For years, the Petrucci family also ran Pal Jack's Pizza next door to the Dinner Theater. It continued for years after they sold the business, but it finally closed in December 2010. The Pal Jack's name is gone, but the old Pizza Pasta Subs awning is still there for the time being at Wings and Things, the new tenant. Before it was Pal Jack's, however, the building saw time as a High's Dairy and a Philco Bendix radio store. The current Aladdin Food Mart at 308 Main Street was the Laurel Clover Farm Market in the 1930s and 40s, run by brothers Harry and Walter Fife, before they opened their Fife Service Center on Montgomery Street in 1950. Perhaps the biggest surprise of all is what the Carpet Center used to be. This little building at 304 Main Street was, in the 1940s, Laurel's Safeway, On the north side of the 300 block, Outback Leather was known as Gayer's Saddlery when it took over the former Athey and Harrison hardware store in the late 1960s. The wooden facade underwent another facelift in 1982. The antique gas pump that still sits at the curb once fueled delivery trucks for Athey and Harrison and was installed in the 1920s. And those who remember George, the plastic horse, can still visit him. He's got a new home at Hard Times Cafe in Alexandria and is frequently part of Old Town's George Washington's birthday parade. Just to the side of Outback Leather is a small concrete pad. This is all that remains of the dispatcher's office of Bob's Cab, the last of Laurel's independent taxi services in the 1980s. At the Route 1 end of Main Street is perhaps its cornerstone, the old Laurel Pharmacy building. It originally had a crown at the top, bearing the year 1898, but that disappeared sometime in the 1920s. The building has seen decades with multiple tenants, including the pharmacy, the Laurel Jewelry Shop, and after the pharmacy closed in 1966, the Trailways Bus Depot was located here, followed by Pitt Printers and Dick Howard's Printing. On the north corner, where an empty lot is now set for 40 years, was the notorious Laurel Hotel, a 19th century establishment that included a restaurant and bar, and by the 1960s became known for its ladies of the evening sitting conspicuously in the upstairs windows. The building was razed in 1974, and while a 7-Eleven was at one time considered, but shot down by the Historic Commission, nothing has ever taken its place. Some shoes are just too big to fill, apparently. I hope you enjoyed this quick little trip down Main Street and back in time. The next time you're in the area, check out some of the places you've seen here today and dig a little deeper. Be sure to watch Laurel TV on Comcast Channel 71 and Verizon Fios Channel 12. And follow Lost Laurel on Facebook. I'm Richard Friend. Thanks for watching.